England's most powerful queen didn't die because she betrayed her king. She died because she failed to give him a son. Within days of his death, some shocking information emerged, but intense research began to cover it up. England's history didn't change inside a palace. It began in a quiet castle that hid its secrets for centuries. Hever Castle. The most mysterious castle in England's history, about which you know very little. This history begins with a mysterious execution.
May 19th, 1536. The dawn breaks cold over the Tower of London. Within its ancient stone walls, on Tower Green, a scaffold has been erected overnight. It stands stark against the morning sky, a platform of death waiting for England's most controversial queen. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England for just 3 years, awakens in her lodgings in the Tower. She is 35 years old. She has been stripped of her title, her dignity, and now her life itself will be taken. The charges against her are monstrous: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, and treason against the king. Most historians today believe these charges were fabricated, a convenient legal fiction to rid King Henry VIII of a wife who had failed to give him a male heir. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, Anne is led out onto the green. She wears a gray damask gown trimmed with fur, and her dark hair is tucked beneath a white coif. A small crowd has gathered, primarily members of the court and officials. This is not a public execution in the traditional sense. The king has granted her one mercy. She will not die by the traditional English method of beheading with an axe. Instead, an expert swordsman has been brought from Calais specifically for this purpose. His sword is sharp, his skill unmatched. It will be quick. Anne mounts the scaffold with remarkable composure. Witnesses later report that she showed no fear. She makes a brief speech, and even now, at the moment of her death, she is careful. She does not accuse Henry directly. She says she has come here to die according to the law, that she will not accuse anyone, and she asks people to pray for the king, calling him a gentle and merciful prince. She asks for prayers for her soul. She forgives her executioner before he is even struck. The executioner, moved by protocol and perhaps by compassion, calls out as if for his sword, distracting Anne for just a moment. In that instant, he draws the blade and strikes. It is over in a single blow. Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed the course of English history, who caused Henry VIII to break with Rome and establish the Church of England, who gave birth to the future Queen Elizabeth I, is dead. Her body is placed in an arrow chest, no proper coffin prepared for a former queen, and buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. But Anne's execution was not just the end of a queen, it was the destruction of an entire family. The Boleyns, who had risen so high, fell catastrophically. Anne's brother George, Lord Rochford, had been executed just 2 days earlier on the same fabricated charges. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, Earl of Wiltshire, though he survived, saw his entire legacy crumble. The family's power, their influence, their very name became tainted with scandal and suspicion. And the family home, the place where Anne had spent her childhood, where she had learned to read and write, where she had played in the gardens and walked along the river, that place was Hever Castle in Kent. Before Anne's execution and in the years that followed, Hever Castle held secrets, witnessed events, and harbored truths that would remain hidden for centuries. Many unknown facts about this castle and the Boleyn family only came to light hundreds of years later through archaeological discoveries, scholarly research, and the careful examination of historical documents. These revelations transformed Hever Castle from simply a historic building into one of the most mysterious and significant castles in all of England, a place where history was made and where the truth was buried, waiting to be uncovered. This is the story of Hever Castle and the undisclosed information that makes it a cornerstone of history. Hever Castle stands in the Kentish countryside, approximately 30 miles southeast of London. The village of Hever is small, quiet, surrounded by rolling hills and farmland. The castle itself is a fortified manor house, built originally in the 13th century, around 1270. It began as a simple country house, constructed by the de Hever family, and was converted into a manor with defensive walls and a gatehouse in 1462 by Geoffrey Boleyn, Anne's great-great-grandfather. Geoffrey Boleyn was a wealthy mercer, a dealer in fine fabrics, who became Lord Mayor of London. He purchased Hever Castle in 1462, and this purchase marked the beginning of the Boleyn family's rise from successful merchants to the nobility. Geoffrey's son, William Boleyn, continued to elevate the family's status, and William's son, Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, would take the family to the highest echelons of power through his service to King Henry VIII and through the marriages of his children. Thomas Boleyn was an accomplished diplomat and courtier. He was educated, spoke several languages, including French and Latin, and served on numerous diplomatic missions for Henry VII and then Henry VIII. He was ambitious for his family, and he saw his children, Mary, Anne, and George, as instruments of that ambition. Thomas brought Hever Castle to its zenith as a family home. It was here that Anne Boleyn spent much of her childhood, though the exact years are debated by historians. One of the undisclosed facts about Hever Castle that only came to light through later research concerns Anne's early education. For many years, it was assumed that Anne spent most of her childhood in the courts of Europe, particularly in France and the Netherlands. However, analysis of household records and correspondence from the early 16th century suggests that Anne spent far more time at Hever than previously believed, particularly in her very early years. It was at Hever that she received her initial education, learning to read and write in English, and where she was first exposed to the religious texts that would later shape her Protestant sympathies. The castle's chapel, a modest structure attached to the main building, was where the Boleyn family attended services. It was a private chapel, as was common for noble families, and it allowed them to worship without leaving the castle grounds. In recent decades, restoration work in the chapel uncovered fragments of medieval wall paintings and inscriptions that had been plastered over during the Reformation. These paintings depict scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary and various saints, indicating that the chapel was once richly decorated in the Catholic tradition. One particularly intriguing discovery was a small carved inscription, barely visible on the stone near the altar. It reads in Latin, "Pray for the soul of Anne." For years, scholars debated whether this referred to Anne Boleyn or another Anne in the family. Carbon dating and stylistic analysis of the carving eventually revealed that it was added sometime between 1536 and 1540, in the years immediately following Anne's execution. The carving's style is rough, as if done quickly or in secret. This suggests that someone, perhaps a family member or a loyal servant, quietly memorialized Anne in the family chapel, despite the danger of being associated with a woman executed for treason. This small act of devotion, hidden for centuries, was one of the first pieces of undisclosed information that began to change our understanding of how Anne was remembered by those who knew her best. After Anne's execution, Hever Castle's fate became uncertain. Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, lost much of his influence at court, though he was not formally punished. He retained Hever Castle until his death in 1539, just 3 years after Anne's execution. With his death, the male line of the Boleyn family ended.
the castle and the Boleyn estates passed out of the family. King Henry VIII, ever eager to consolidate property and erase uncomfortable memories, granted Hever Castle to Anne of Cleves in 1540 as part of her divorce settlement when Henry annulled their brief marriage. This is one of history's ironies. Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's childhood home, became the property of another of Henry's discarded wives. Anne of Cleves, however, never lived at Hever Castle. She preferred other properties granted to her, and Hever remained largely unoccupied during her ownership. When Anne of Cleves died in 1557, the castle reverted to the crown, and it was then granted to various families over the subsequent centuries. During the reigns of Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, Hever Castle faded from prominence. It became a simple country estate, rented out to tenant farmers, its glorious connection to the Boleyn family almost forgotten. It is during this period, from the mid-16th century to the late 19th century, that Hever Castle essentially disappeared from historical consciousness. Very few records exist about who lived there, what happened within its walls, or how the building was maintained. This 300-year gap in the castle's history is itself a form of undisclosed information. We simply do not know what transpired at Hever for much of this time. What we do know is that by the late 19th century, the castle had fallen into serious disrepair. The roof leaked, the walls were crumbling, and the interior was filled with centuries of accumulated debris and decay. The castle was a ruin, a forgotten monument to a family that had once been at the center of history. Then, in 1903, everything changed. William Waldorf Astor, an American millionaire and one of the wealthiest men in the world, purchased Hever Castle. Astor was fascinated by history and particularly by the story of Anne Boleyn. He had moved to England in 1890, renouncing his American citizenship and becoming a British subject. He was determined to restore Hever Castle to its former glory and to uncover its secrets. Astor's restoration of Hever Castle was extraordinary in its scope and ambition. He employed over 1,000 workers and spent what would be tens of millions of dollars in today's currency. He rebuilt the castle's interior, adding modern amenities while attempting to preserve or recreate the Tudor atmosphere. He constructed a mock Tudor village adjacent to the castle to house staff and guests, as the castle itself was too small to accommodate everyone. He excavated and restored the moat, planted extensive gardens, and filled the castle with period furniture, tapestries, and artwork, some authentic and some reproduction. But Astor's most significant contribution was his interest in the castle's history. He hired researchers and historians to investigate Hever Castle's past, to examine every stone, every room, every artifact found during the restoration. And it was during this process that some of the most startling undisclosed information about Hever Castle came to light. During excavations of the castle's foundations and cellars, workers discovered a hidden chamber beneath the Great Hall. This chamber had been sealed off, likely for centuries, and its entrance had been completely obscured by later construction. Inside, they found a collection of personal items, including jewelry, coins, fragments of clothing, and most remarkably, a small collection of letters and documents. These items had been carefully wrapped and stored, as if someone had intended to preserve them for posterity or to hide them from prying eyes. The letters were in Tudor handwriting, and it took months of careful preservation and analysis to make them readable. When they were finally deciphered, they revealed correspondence between Anne Boleyn and members of her family, particularly her mother, Elizabeth Howard Boleyn. These letters had never been published or referenced in any historical account. They were completely unknown to historians. The content of the letters is deeply personal. Anne writes to her mother about her fears regarding King Henry's attentions, about her reluctance to become his mistress as her sister Mary had been, and about her calculations that she might become queen if she played her hand correctly. She also writes about her religious beliefs, her support for reformist ideas, and her frustrations with the corruption she perceives in the Catholic Church. One letter, dated to around 1527, is particularly revealing. Anne writes to her mother expressing her doubt about whether marrying Henry would truly bring the happiness and security she seeks. She writes, and I paraphrase from the translated and modernized text, that she fears the king's love is changeable, that what he loves one day he may despise the next, and that she worries about the fate that might await her if she fails to give him a son. This letter, written years before she became queen and nearly a decade before her execution, shows that Anne had a clear-eyed understanding of the risks she was taking. The existence of this letter and others like it fundamentally changed historians' understanding of Anne Boleyn as a passive victim or a calculating seductress. Instead, she emerges as a complex, intelligent woman who understood the dangerous game she was playing, but chose to play it anyway, perhaps because she saw no other path to power and influence in a world that offered women so few options. The letters also revealed something else. Elizabeth Boleyn, Anne's mother, was far more involved in her daughter's rise than previously known. Historical accounts often portrayed Elizabeth as a shadowy figure, overshadowed by her ambitious husband and her famous children. But the letters show that Elizabeth was a strategic thinker in her own right, advising Anne on how to navigate the court, how to maintain the king's interest without surrendering to him, and how to position herself as a potential queen rather than a mere mistress. Elizabeth's letters to Anne are filled with coded language and references that suggest she understood the political stakes and was actively coaching her daughter. This undisclosed information about Elizabeth Boleyn's role has led to a reassessment of the family dynamics and the strategic planning that went into Anne's rise to power.
Another significant discovery at Hever Castle concerned the physical layout of the building itself. During Astor's restoration, architects noticed that several rooms had been modified in ways that didn't make structural sense. Walls had been built where no walls were needed, doorways had been sealed, and some rooms were oddly shaped. Upon investigation, they discovered that these modifications had been made in the decades immediately following Anne's execution, likely during the time when Henry VIII owned the castle or shortly after. It appeared that certain rooms had been deliberately obscured or divided to hide or erase the evidence of their original purpose. One such room was what is now known as the Anne Boleyn Room, a bedchamber on the second floor of the castle. For centuries, it had been divided by a later wall into two smaller rooms. When the wall was removed during restoration, the original chamber was revealed to be quite large and well-appointed, with remnants of Tudor-era paneling and a magnificent fireplace. But the most extraordinary discovery was what was found hidden behind the paneling. Workers discovered a small alcove, perhaps originally used for storage or prayer, that contained more artifacts: a book of hours, a prayer book used for private devotion, with Anne Boleyn's signature inscribed in the front. The signature was authenticated by experts as genuine. The Book of Hours itself is beautifully illuminated, suggesting it was a treasured possession. What makes this discovery so significant is what was written in the margins. Throughout the book, Anne had made notes in her own hand, commenting on the prayers, reflecting on scripture, and recording her thoughts. Some of these notes are dated, providing a kind of spiritual diary of Anne's inner life during her time at court. One note, written beside a prayer for protection from enemies, is dated to early 1536, just months before her arrest. It reads, "God knows the truth of my innocence, and should I die, let him judge those who bear false witness." This note, written in Anne's own hand, is a powerful testimony to her belief in her own innocence of the charges that would be brought against her. It also suggests that she had some premonition of danger, that she sensed the net closing around her even before her arrest. The discovery of this Book of Hours and its marginalia provided historians with direct access to Anne's thoughts and feelings in a way that had never been possible before. It was a voice from the past speaking across the centuries, and it was found hidden in the walls of her childhood home. Astor's researchers also uncovered evidence of secret meetings that took place at Hever Castle during Anne's rise to power.
Analysis of household accounts from the 1520s and early 1530s showed that Thomas Boleyn entertained numerous high-ranking visitors at Hever, including Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Cranmer, and other men who would later become key figures in Henry's break with Rome. These visits were not widely publicized at the time, and they suggest that Hever Castle served as a kind of strategic planning headquarters for the religious and political revolution that was about to transform England. It was here, in the quiet Kentish countryside, that some of the most consequential decisions in history may have been discussed and debated. This transforms our understanding of Hever Castle from a simple family home into a site of historical and political significance comparable to the great palaces and council chambers of London.
Following Astor's death in 1919, Hever Castle passed to his son, then to subsequent members of the Astor family. During the 20th century, further research and archaeological work continued to reveal undisclosed information. In the 1970s, a team of archaeologists conducted a systematic survey of the castle grounds, using then new technologies like ground-penetrating radar. They discovered evidence of structures that no longer existed: a larger gatehouse, additional outbuildings, and what appeared to be a substantial garden complex that had been destroyed or buried centuries earlier. Excavations in the 1980s and 1990s revealed that this garden was far more elaborate than anyone had suspected, with evidence of fountains, topiary, and planted walks. The garden would have been one of the finest in England during the Tudor period, rivaling the royal gardens at Hampton Court. This discovery challenged the assumption that Hever was a modest country estate. Instead, it appears that the Boleyns invested heavily in displaying their wealth and status through their home and grounds, making Hever a showcase property designed to impress visitors and rival the estates of the greatest nobles in the land. In 2003, on the 500th anniversary of Anne Boleyn's birth, a team of historians was given unprecedented access to the castle's archives, including materials that had been in private hands and not previously available to scholars. Among these materials were household accounts, inventories, and personal correspondence that filled in many gaps in our knowledge of daily life at Hever. One particularly fascinating find was an inventory of Anne's personal possessions taken shortly after her execution, when her goods were seized by the crown. The inventory lists her clothing, jewelry, books, and household items in meticulous detail. It reveals that Anne owned an extensive wardrobe, including French gowns that were at the cutting edge of fashion, and a library of over 30 books, an extraordinary number for a woman of her time. The inventory also lists items that had been gifts from Henry, including a gold locket and several pieces of jewelry set with pearls and diamonds. The fact that this inventory survived and was preserved at Hever suggests that someone, perhaps Thomas Boleyn himself, made efforts to retain records of Anne's life even after her disgrace. Another piece of undisclosed information emerged from the study of the castle's architecture. Dendrochronology, the scientific method of dating wood based on tree rings, was applied to the timber beams in the castle's roof and floors. This analysis revealed that several sections of the castle had been modified or rebuilt in the late 1920s and early 1930s, precisely during the period when Anne was rising to prominence at court. The modifications included enlarging the Great Hall, adding more windows to allow in natural light, and upgrading the private chambers. This suggests that Thomas Boleyn was deliberately enhancing Hever Castle to reflect his family's elevated status and perhaps to make it a suitable venue for entertaining the king himself. There is circumstantial evidence, though no definitive proof, that Henry VIII may have visited Hever Castle during his courtship of Anne, though no contemporary accounts explicitly confirm such a visit. The architectural changes, however, suggest that the Boleyns were preparing for the possibility.
The mystery of what happened to Anne Boleyn's remains after her execution has long fascinated historians. While her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Tower of London, rumors persisted for centuries that her heart had been removed and buried elsewhere. In the 19th century, a heart-shaped lead casket was discovered in a church near Hever in the village of Arwarton in Suffolk, where Anne's uncle lived. Some speculated that this might contain Anne's heart, though there was no way to confirm it, and the casket was reburied without being opened. Modern historians are skeptical of this claim, but it points to the enduring power of Anne's story and the desire to find some tangible connection to her physical remains. What is known is that at Hever Castle, there is a memorial to Anne Boleyn, erected by William Waldorf Astor in the early 20th century. It is a simple stone marker in the gardens, inscribed with her name and dates. This memorial, created 400 years after her death, represents an attempt to honor and remember a woman who was erased from official memory for centuries. It is, in its way, another piece of undisclosed information made visible, the acknowledgement that Anne Boleyn, whatever her faults or mistakes, deserves to be remembered with dignity. In recent years, advances in digital humanities and data analysis have allowed historians to examine Hever Castle's history in new ways. Scholars have digitized and analyzed thousands of documents related to the Boleyn family, the castle, and the Tudor period, looking for patterns and connections that might have been missed by earlier researchers who had to work with physical documents. This work has revealed a network of relationships and correspondences that shows the Boleyns were far more connected to European intellectual and political movements than previously understood. Anne, in particular, corresponded with religious reformers in France and Germany, and she used her position to promote reform-minded clergy and scholars in England. This makes her not just a queen or a victim, but an active participant in one of the most significant intellectual and religious movements of the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation. Hever Castle, as the place where Anne formed her early ideas and maintained connections with her family, was thus a node in a much larger network of religious and political change. The castle's role in history did not end with the Boleyns. During the English Civil War in the 17th century, Hever Castle was garrisoned by parliamentarian forces, and there is evidence of skirmishes in the area. During the Second World War, the castle was used to house evacuated children from London, providing them shelter during the Blitz. These later chapters in Hever's history are less well known, but equally part of its story. The castle has been a home, a fortress, a symbol, and a refuge across 8 centuries of English history. Today, Hever Castle is open to the public as a tourist attraction and historical site. Visitors can walk through the rooms where Anne Boleyn lived, see the artifacts that have been discovered, and explore the gardens that have been restored to their Tudor glory. The castle hosts events, educational programs, and exhibitions that bring its history to life. It is one of England's most visited historic houses, attracting people from around the world who are fascinated by the Tudor period and by Anne Boleyn's story. But perhaps the most important undisclosed information about Hever Castle is not a fact or a document, but a realization that places have memories, that buildings hold stories, and that history is not just about kings and queens, battles and treaties, but about the ordinary and extraordinary lives lived in specific places. Hever Castle is a stone and timber structure, but it is also a repository of human experience, of ambition and love, fear and courage, triumph and tragedy. The undisclosed information that has been uncovered over the centuries has transformed Hever from a forgotten ruin into one of the most important historical sites in England, a place where we can connect with the past in a direct and tangible way. And so we return to that morning in May 1536, to the moment when Anne Boleyn laid her head upon the block and her life ended with a single stroke of a sword. Her execution destroyed her family's power, scattered their possessions, and seemed to erase them from history. Hever Castle, the place where she had lived and dreamed, where she had learned and grown, became just another property passed from hand to hand, its significance forgotten. But history has a way of resurfacing.
Through the work of archaeologists, historians, architects, and preservationists, through the discovery of hidden chambers and secret letters, through the analysis of documents and the careful restoration of buildings, the truth about Hever Castle has been gradually revealed. We now know that it was not just a home, but a center of political and religious intrigue. We know that Anne Boleyn was not simply a victim or a villain, but a complex woman who understood the risks she was taking and chose her path with open eyes. We know that her family was deeply involved in the religious and political transformations that created modern England, and we know that Hever Castle holds within its walls the evidence of all of this. It is a place where private lives intersected with public history, where the personal and the political were inseparable, and where the consequences of those intersections changed a nation forever. Anne Boleyn's execution may have been intended to erase her and her family from memory, but instead it immortalized them. And Hever Castle, her childhood home, stands as a monument not just to her, but to all those whose stories were hidden, whose truths were suppressed, and whose lives deserve to be remembered and understood. Every stone of Hever Castle has a story to tell. Every room holds echoes of conversations long past. Every artifact discovered is a piece of a larger puzzle that we are still assembling, 500 years after the events that made this place famous. The mystery of Hever Castle is not one that can ever be completely solved, because history is not a puzzle with a single solution. It is an ongoing conversation between past and present, a dialogue between the dead and the living, mediated by the places and objects they left behind. Hever Castle endures. It has survived wars and revolutions, neglect and restoration, the rise and fall of dynasties. It has witnessed the best and worst of human nature, and it continues to teach us, to challenge us, and to remind us that the past is never truly past, that history is alive in the places we inhabit and the stories we tell. The undisclosed information about Hever Castle is ultimately about the power of memory and the resilience of truth. No matter how deeply secrets are buried, no matter how thoroughly history is rewritten, the truth has a way of emerging into the light. This is the story of Hever Castle, a place where history was made and history is remembered, where a queen was born and a family was destroyed, where secrets were hidden and truth was preserved. It is one of England's most mysterious castles, and its mysteries continue to captivate us, to draw us in, and to connect us with a past that shaped the world we live in today. Summary report. Hever Castle stands in the Kentish countryside, about 30 miles southeast of London. It was built originally around 1270 and converted into a fortified manor in 1462 by Geoffrey Boleyn, Anne's great-great-grandfather. Geoffrey was a wealthy London merchant who purchased Hever, marking the Boleyn family's rise from trade to nobility. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, was an accomplished diplomat who brought the castle to its zenith. Here, Anne spent much of her childhood, though historians long believed she was mostly educated abroad. However, analysis of household records revealed that Anne spent far more time at Hever than previously thought. It was here she learned to read and write and accessed the family's library of religious and philosophical texts that shaped her Protestant sympathies. The castle's chapel held the first major undisclosed secret. During 20th century restoration work, workers uncovered medieval wall paintings that had been plastered over. Most remarkably, they found a small carved inscription near the altar reading in Latin, "Pray for the soul of Anne." Scientific analysis dated this carving to between 1536 and 1540, just after Anne's execution. Its rough, hurried style suggests someone memorialized her in secret, despite the danger of honoring a woman executed for treason. This hidden tribute, discovered centuries later, was the first clue that Anne was remembered with love by those who knew her. After Anne's execution, Thomas Boleyn retained Hever until his death in 1539. The castle then passed to Anne of Cleves, another of Henry's discarded wives, though she never lived there. For the next 300 years, Hever faded from history, becoming a neglected country estate. By the late 1900s, it was a crumbling ruin. Then, in 1903, American millionaire William Waldorf Oster purchased Hever Castle. Fascinated by Anne Boleyn's story, he spent a fortune restoring it and hired historians to investigate its past. During this restoration, the most extraordinary discoveries were made. Workers found a hidden chamber beneath the Great Hall that had been sealed for centuries. Inside were personal items, and most remarkably, a collection of letters in Tudor handwriting. These letters, completely unknown to historians, were correspondence between Anne Boleyn and her family, particularly her mother, Elizabeth. The letters were deeply personal. Anne wrote about her fears regarding King Henry's attention, her reluctance to become his mistress like her sister Mary had been, and her calculation that she might become queen. One letter from around 1527 is particularly revealing. Anne expresses doubt about marrying Henry, fearing his love is changeable and worrying about her fate if she fails to give him a son. This letter, written years before she became queen, shows Anne clearly understood the dangerous game she was playing, but chose to proceed anyway.
The letters also revealed that Anne's mother, Elizabeth, was far more strategically involved than history had recorded. She actively coached Anne on navigating the court and positioning herself as a potential queen rather than a mistress. This discovery fundamentally changed historians' understanding of both Anne and her mother. Another major discovery concerned the castle's layout. Architects noticed rooms had been oddly modified in the decades after Anne's execution, with walls built where none were needed and doorways sealed. One such room was Anne Boleyn's bedchamber, which had been divided by a later wall. When removed during restoration, workers found a hidden alcove behind the paneling containing Anne's personal book of hours, a prayer book with her authenticated signature. Throughout this book, Anne had written notes in her own hand, creating a spiritual diary. One note beside a prayer for protection, dated early 1536, just months before her arrest, reads, "God knows the truth of my innocence, and should I die, let him judge those who bear false witness." This was Anne's own voice, speaking across centuries, found hidden in the walls of her childhood home, testifying to her belief in her innocence. Astor's researchers also discovered evidence of secret meetings at Hever during Anne's rise. Household accounts showed Thomas Boleyn entertained key figures like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, men who would orchestrate Henry's break with Rome. These unpublicized visits suggest Hever served as a strategic headquarters for planning the religious revolution that transformed England. Archaeological surveys in the 1970s using ground-penetrating radar revealed evidence of elaborate gardens that had been destroyed centuries earlier. Excavations showed these Tudor gardens rivaled those at Hampton Court, challenging the assumption that Hever was a modest estate. The Boleyns had created a showcase property designed to display their wealth and status. In 2003, historians accessed previously private archives and found an inventory of Anne's personal possessions taken after her execution. It listed an extensive wardrobe of fashionable French gowns and a library of over 30 books, extraordinary for a woman of her time. The inventory's survival at Hever suggests someone deliberately preserved records of Anne's life despite her disgrace. Scientific dating of the castle's timber revealed sections were upgraded in the late 2020s and early 3030s, precisely when Anne was rising to prominence. The Great Hall was enlarged, windows added, private chambers upgraded. Thomas Boleyn was preparing Hever to reflect the family's elevated status and possibly to receive the king himself. Recent digital analysis of thousands of documents has revealed the Boleyns were connected to European intellectual movements far more than previously understood. Anne corresponded with religious reformers across Europe and used her position to promote Protestant ideas in England. Hever Castle was thus a node in the network of religious and political change that created the Protestant Reformation.
Time passed. Kings died. Dynasties collapsed. But Hever Castle remained. Its walls still stood beside the River Eden, calm and beautiful, almost innocent. Visitors walked its gardens, admired its rooms, took photographs, believing the story was finished. But history doesn't end when people stop looking. It hides. For centuries, Hever Castle was treated as nothing more than the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. A footnote, a prologue, a place left behind once the crown was lost and the head fell. Yet the castle itself never forgot. Behind restored walls and carefully preserved rooms, inconsistencies remained. Rooms that did not match official records. Alterations made without explanation. Documents that referenced spaces that supposedly never existed. When historians began comparing royal letters, household accounts, and architectural evidence, something disturbing emerged. Hever Castle was not just a family residence, it was an operational center of influence. Private meetings took place here, away from London. Political discussions that never reached the official court records. Early strategies that shaped Anne Boleyn long before she ever became queen. This castle didn't witness ambition, it engineered it. Archaeological findings revealed modifications made during critical years. Hidden staircases, sealed chambers, and structural changes designed for privacy, not comfort. These were not the renovations of a country home. They were the features of a place where information needed to be controlled. Even more unsettling were the gaps. Letters referencing conversations that have no surviving replies. Names mentioned once, then erased from all later documents. Household members who vanished from records immediately after Anne's fall. Not executed, not exiled, just gone. History calls this coincidence. Power calls it cleanup. After Anne's execution, Hever Castle fell silent, but not abandoned. The Boleyn name became dangerous. Anything connected to it became a liability. So records were edited, ownership was transferred, stories were softened. The castle was allowed to survive, but only after its truth was buried. What remains today is a carefully curated version of history.
Safe, contained, acceptable. But buried beneath that version is another Hever Castle, a place where England's future was quietly negotiated, where loyalty was tested, where the foundations of religious revolution were laid before the world ever knew change was coming. Anne Boleyn did not rise by chance, and she did not fall alone. Hever Castle was the beginning, and after her death, it became the vault. A vault of decisions that could not be acknowledged, a vault of relationships that could not survive the crown's wrath, a vault of truths that threatened the legitimacy of power itself. That is why no grave here is marked, why some rooms feel deliberately empty, why some questions still have no answers. Because revealing everything would not just change how we see Anne Boleyn, it would change how we understand England's transformation. Not as destiny, not as divine will, but as strategy. Today, Hever Castle stands open to the public, but its most important story remains closed. Not because we lack evidence, but because some truths were never meant to be fully uncovered. And perhaps that was the final decision made within these walls. Hever Castle didn't just witness history, it helped decide what history was allowed to remember.